If you have wooden cabinets or painted cabinets that are falling apart and want to give them new life, this is the video for you. In this video, I'm going to cover every detail of properly painting your cabinets so they look amazing and last a long time. By the end of this video, you'll know everything you need to know to get even better results than a professional and save thousands of dollars. Painting cabinets correctly is a lengthy process. I got quotes to paint my cabinets anywhere from $3,000 to $7,000 for a relatively small kitchen. And to be clear, this is not the contractors trying to price gouge me. The reality is it takes a lot of labor and time. Additionally, if you go with a cheap quote, you're bound to have someone who is going to cut corners and provide a worse service to be able to provide that cheaper price. Fortunately, if you're on a budget and have a few days to spare, this video will cover absolutely everything you need to know, and chances are you care more about doing the things right than someone you hire would care. So let's get started. First of all, painting with a brush and roller is the cheapest and fastest option to paint your cabinets. The reality is that brush and roller will never achieve perfect results. That's why cars are never painted with a brush and roller. They always have to be sprayed. You're going to have brush marks, uneven coats, and imperfections in the finished product. Now, this is not necessarily a terrible thing. In fact, I could see how many people might even like the aesthetic of a hand-painted surface. But for the most modern look and clean look, you're going to have to spray. But it takes a lot more consideration to spray cabinets. You'll have to take additional steps in prepping the area, heavily masking, ensuring no leaks or overspray get out of the kitchen, use protective gear, clean and maintain the equipment, and clean up afterwards a lot more. But don't be discouraged. Even though it's a lot more steps, it's a challenge that's certainly achievable by just about anybody. When you're selecting your supplies, quality matters. If you select cheap paint, sandpaper, or masking materials, it'll present itself down the line as more hassle and at the end of the day, potentially more cost. So a lot of materials, it's worth it to get good quality. Paint, for example, is not made equal. High quality paints will have easier application, better durability, and better color retention. My choice of paint brand is Sherwin-Williams Emerald Urethane Trim Enamel. But trim paints from all the other major brands are also decent. Once you've selected your color and you go to purchase it, you'll be asked to select a sheen. Sheen refers to essentially how shiny or dull the paint is. And each paint has its pros and cons. A very flat or dull paint is great at hiding imperfections on the surface, but it's very difficult to clean once it does get dirty. On the other hand, a high gloss has its drawbacks as well. Shiny paint will make any bump or imperfection in the surface very visible against light, which includes minor imperfections during the painting process or damage as the cabinets get used. However, on the positive side, a high gloss finish is very easy to clean, which is a great plus, especially in the kitchen. Now, generally speaking, satin is the way to go. It's right in the middle. It has the benefits of hiding some imperfections in the surface, yet still having some shine to it. So satin is a happy medium with benefits of both worlds. You'll also need to select a primer. Bin primer is the best at covering up stains and smells, as well as blocking tannins from coming through wood. Tannins are remaining oils or stains in the wood that can bleed through the paint, leaving an ugly spot on your brand new paint. So if you're worried about that, bin primer will do the best job at covering all that up. However, it has its drawbacks. Bin primer is very strong and it's bad for your health if inhaled, more so than the other options. So if you're not worried about tannins or odors, then you can make do with a lighter primer from one of the other brands that aren't as difficult to handle. An interesting thing to note as well is that paint fumes are harmful through your ears and can cause damage over time. Now, if you're not a professional and you don't spend every day in paint fumes, chances are it's not going to do much damage. But regardless, it's a worthwhile extra step to take care of those little things for your health. Okay, now hopefully I'm not boring you yet, because all of these are important details that will make the whole process a lot easier. And when it comes to getting a great finish on your paint job, it is 90% prep work and 10% painting. So stick with me because we still have a lot to do before we can get to painting. To start out, we want to take all the drawers and doors off of our kitchen. But before we can do that, we have a couple of additional steps. First of all, we're going to need to completely empty out all of our drawers, as these will need to be removed. Next, you'll want to go through your cabinets and select things you may need to continue to use. Later on, we'll be masking off the boxes, so you won't have access to anything that's in the boxes right now. So make sure to at least put aside a couple of cups, plates, bowls, utensils, and whatever else you might need. After that, our final step before removing everything is to label everything. You want to label every single door and drawer so they go back into their original location. Now, even though many of these doors may be exactly the same, everything just goes back together a lot smoother and a lot easier when they return to their original location. And the same goes for the hardware. Usually the hardware is bent in a certain way that fits the door and box just right. So make sure you also keep track of where each hinge goes. You could either label the hinges and put them in a plastic bag, or put them in the cabinet in their respective location. Now in my case, this doesn't matter because I am changing all of the hardware from this old hardware to hidden hinges. Once everything is cleaned out of the cabinets and everything is labeled, we're ready to remove all the doors. Sliding drawers will typically come in two kinds. This simpler wheel and rail design, which comes off by simply pulling the drawer to its limit, then lifting the box out and letting the box hinge down. And just like that, the box simply lifts out. Now with the bearing slider, it's equally as easy. Again, you need to pull the drawer out to its limit. Then on each side, there's a little black tab which you pull on. On one side, this tab goes down, and on the other side, the tab goes up. Once you pull those tabs, the drawer can continue to slide out all the way and come off completely. Now the doors will typically be held in with simple Phillips head screws. So get a screwdriver and lefty-loosey them out of the way. Now, an electric screwdriver or impact helps speed up the process here, but is not necessary by any means. And with a little bit of movie magic, we could speed this up. Next, in my case, I'm gonna go ahead and move my fridge and stove out of the way. Additionally, we're also going to take down my exhaust vent since it's easy enough. I also removed my drawer sliders from the boxes, as in my case they're in the way. And the final step here is to clean everything up and remove anything that might be on the countertops or get in the way as we're painting. And with all the doors removed, we're ready to start prepping everything. I used some large totes with wheels to easily move all the doors to the garage where they're a little bit easier to work on. Now in my case, I'm going to first drill out the holes for my new hardware. Now if you also have old hardware, this is a great opportunity to save some money and do it yourself. I was personally quoted $950. So that's another win for the savings, and I'm gonna go ahead and do it myself. Once the drawers were all drilled, I transferred the labels to the hole where the hardware goes and covered it with tape. This will allow me to still see those labels after the door has been painted. Now we could start prepping the doors. The first step is to clean them. This is extremely important, especially for doors that are near the stove or where any grease or other grime gets stuck to the surface. If you don't properly clean the doors, that grime that's left behind under the paint will lift the paint up and ruin the paint job. So use some sort of degreaser and thoroughly scrub every single door. In my case, my doors have some felt pads in the corners, which must be completely removed as well. A chisel works well here to ensure I'm all the way down to bare wood. Next, if you're changing the hardware, this is a good opportunity to fill in the holes with wood filler so you could put new hardware wherever you want. But in my case, I'm using the exact same hardware, so I'm leaving the holes as is. Next, if you have oak, you'll also need to fill the grain. Now, if your wood doesn't have texture and is very smooth, you can skip this step. Unfortunately, you don't have to worry about this. But oak has a lot of texture and grain. This texture will be visible in the final product if you don't do something about it. And unfortunately, sanding is just not enough to get a smooth surface. We could sand all day, but we're going to continue to uncover more texture. Instead, what we have to do is fill in that texture with a filler. And a product that's great and designed to do this is Aqua Coat. To apply this, we first need to sand with 120 grit until the shine is completely removed from our doors. We can use a sanding sponge for the contours and uneven sides. Next, make sure to thoroughly clean off all the dust. Next, use a plastic scraper to apply a little bit of Aqua Coat and scrape it around, making sure to get coverage all around except for the inner corners where the floating center meets the stile. Now, it's fine if it gets into this corner, but it's a little bit harder to clean out and doesn't need any filler here. Alright, once you've used filler and applied it all over the place, use the scraper again to remove any excess from the surface. If you have uneven edges, you could also apply the Aqua Coat with a rag and lightly wipe it down. This will fill in the grain in those curves. After applying the coat, wait 45 minutes for the filler to dry. After 45 minutes, you want to repeat the exact same steps. Again, you'll sand the door with 120, then clean the door, and then again, apply the aqua coat and leave it for 45 minutes to dry. If you only apply the coat once, it's going to leave behind a lot of texture still. So the more times you apply this filler, the better and smoother the final product will be. I suggest doing a minimum of 2 passes, but in my case, I'm going to do 3 passes on everything. After your final fill coat of aqua coat, you want to sand with 220 grit. Now, the higher the number, the finer the sandpaper, but don't go any higher than 220. On the inside of your home, you're going to have to prepare your boxes in the exact same way. But before doing that, I'm also replacing my countertop now that we're working on our kitchen. Additionally, before working on the boxes, it's a good idea to mask off everything in the kitchen. Do not underestimate the amount of overspray and dust that's going to get around the house. You'll need to mask off every wall and door to fully ensure the paint doesn't land into the rest of your home. This masking will also prepare your cabinets for the painting process as well. It's also going to keep dust from getting into the rest of your home. So before sanding the boxes, I'm gonna go ahead and fully mask off everything. I'm gonna start off by masking the floor with masking paper. You can buy a roll of this for very cheap at your local Home Depot. I'm also using smaller pieces of masking paper for the contours and edges around the cabinets. On the floor, I'm masking off every edge with tape. If you have laminate and wood floors, be very careful here. If you use tape that is too strong, it can damage delicate floors. There are certain coatings that will pull up with strong tapes, so be careful with that and use yellow frog tape if you think the floor is delicate. The yellow frog tape is designed for delicate surfaces. Next, we're going to mask off the drawer openings, which looks harder than it is. Simply get your masking tape and place it against the rim facing out on every edge of your box. Then use some masking plastic or paper to lay over this tape and seal the openings shut. You can buy some rolls of plastic that already have tape on them and fold out to become a larger piece of masking plastic. This masking plastic is very useful, and there's also a professional tool that allows you to add your own tape and your own plastic, but this is quite expensive at $60 and is more for professionals. So you can make do with the cheaper disposable options. Now, don't worry if it's not perfect. If some holes are left, you can come back with more tape and seal off those holes. If you have any excess at the bottom, you could also use a sharp utility blade to lightly score the plastic and cut it off without cutting through the tape. Then I finished masking off the entire kitchen, which is quite simple with this fold-out plastic. Tape around the top edge, then put the plastic, unfold the plastic down, and tape the plastic to the bottom. I also masked the openings where the countertop was, as well as the space under the boxes. We also masked off the ceiling directly above the boxes, as we're going to have to spray here. But other than that, the paint is unlikely to drift up into the ceiling, so you typically don't have to mask off your entire ceiling. However, if you do have AC vents, you'll either have to close them or mask them off to avoid getting an upward draft. Now to get in and out of the kitchen, we used some zippers that stick onto the plastic. After sticking the zippers onto the plastic, you cut in between it, and now you have access in and out of the kitchen that you can close and open as needed. Next, we're ready to prepare our cabinet boxes in the exact same way we did our doors. You'll degrease them and thoroughly clean them, especially near the stove or any appliances that generate heat. Then sand and clean the boxes. If you have oak, fill the grain with your aqua coat, then sand with 220 grit. If you're doing the filler, apply the filler 2 to 4 times. Now in my case, I have some very deep cuts in some portions of my boxes, so I'm going to use some regular wood filler to get these larger scuffs filled in. Now, when you're sanding in an enclosed area, it's important to use a respirator so you're not breathing in a ton of dust. So make sure you're taking the proper precautions and using a respirator. Once everything is cleaned, prepared, masked, filled, and sanded, we're getting close to painting our boxes. But there is one more detail we have to think about, and that is where you're going to place your doors to dry after they're painted. Now, most people suggest getting some screws and hangers like this and screwing them into the bottom or top of the door where they won't be visible. Then using a rod perched on 2 ends, using clothes hangers to hang them. And this is not a bad idea at all. It's simple, doesn't take up a ton of space, and allows you to paint both sides of the door at once. However, if you're going for absolute perfection, this is not the best option. Hanging the doors will increase the potential of the paint running and making drip marks. On the other hand, if you lay the doors flat, the paint will tend to level out more and leave a smoother, nicer finish. So in my case, I built a rack out of wood that could hold all of my doors. Now, truth be told, I think the difference that it'll make is minuscule, and it's probably easier, cheaper, and faster to go ahead and hang the doors. So unless you're aiming for absolute perfection, I recommend just hanging the doors on a rod. Now, it has been quite a journey to get to this point, and we haven't painted a single thing. This is why painters say it's 90% prep work and 10% painting. So don't worry, even though it's taken a lot of work to get to this point, we are 90% there. Now, before we paint, we want to make sure we have the proper respirator, eye protection, and ear protection. I made a mistake and I did not have the proper respirator. The filter I ordered said on the listing it was for paint, but the listing was wrong. The filter I received was for smells only, not for paint fumes, which was a huge mistake. I'll spoil the surprise for you, but I got very sick. I ended up spending an entire week just laying in bed and another week feeling messed up. So make sure to get the proper filter, which is the 6001 OV. You can find this in the link below or at your local Home Depot under the name Paint Project Respirator Filter. Next, when it comes to your paint sprayer for your kitchen cabinets, you have two main options: HVLP sprayers and airless sprayers. The cheapest option is an HVLP, which you can get one as cheap as $30 on Amazon. But a decent one from a name brand is going to cost around $500. On the other hand, an airless sprayer can be found for a decent quality for $300. And for that reason, the Graco airless sprayer is generally the best option. However, to prove that a $30 HVLP sprayer can do the job, I decided to spray my primer with the HVLP sprayer. To paint the doors, I set up a table with masking plastic over it to keep it clean since we're painting flat. I also have a fan in the window to ventilate the fumes outside. Now this step isn't necessary for most primers, but because I'm using a shellac-based primer that has a lot of odor, I'm gonna go ahead and set up this ventilation to get the fumes out. Now right before painting, I went ahead and wiped down every single door to ensure there's no dust on them that may have landed on them while they were sitting. Next, with the correct filter, unlike myself, and proper work clothes that you don't mind getting paint on, you're ready to get painting. The first step is to use a paint mixer to get your paint nice and mixed in. After thoroughly mixing your paint, load it up into the container for your sprayer or put your pickup tube into the bucket. Now before spraying, you always want to practice your pattern, especially if it's a sprayer that you've never used before. From here, you can get an idea of how it works and start to adjust the sprayer, either adjust for more or less spray to come out, and adjust the pattern. Once you're confident with your sprayer, you could start with your first door. If you're painting flat like me, you'll also need some paint triangles to keep the bottom from touching the table and getting paint or other grime on it. But if you're hanging the doors, then you simply hang the door in place. The idea here is light and even coats. There's a sweet spot between speed, application, and overlap. And with all that, you can get to painting all your doors. Now, as you're painting, always inspect the results and adjust accordingly. If you start to see paint running, or maybe the layers feel a little bit thick, you're going to have to either decrease the flow or increase your speed. Now, if you're seeing missing spots or spots that aren't really getting covered enough, you either want to decrease your speed or increase the flow of paint. Now in my case, the first doors were coming out good, but I got a little bit comfortable and started making mistakes. Now hopefully you can learn from my mistakes. Most of the doors came out good, but occasionally I would pause and return while still painting the surface. This means that at the very end, I applied a little bit too much paint on the edges. This caused the paint to immediately start running because I over applied here. So keep this in mind and avoid this mistake of pausing at the end of your doors and applying too much paint. Now if you do end up applying too much paint and it starts to run, don't worry, I'm going to show you how we can fix this. If you're hanging the doors, you can paint both sides at once, but if you're laying them flat like me, you're going to have to paint one side and let them sit for about 30 minutes to 40 minutes to dry to the touch so we can turn them over and paint the other side. So as we're waiting for one side to dry to the touch, we're gonna go ahead and paint our boxes. And the same rules apply for our boxes. You wanna move quickly, avoid too much paint, and get full coverage on all surfaces. When I was priming the boxes, I missed a small part here, but that doesn't matter. Afterwards, we're going to fix that, and I'm gonna show you how to fix it in case you also miss a spot. So after waiting for about 40 minutes for the doors to dry to the touch, we can start priming the other side. Additionally, don't forget the drawers. Sometimes the drawer faces do come off of the boxes with a couple of screws, and it might be worth removing. However, in my case, they're glued on, so we're simply gonna mask the boxes and paint the drawer faces. And with that, the priming is finally done. Next is the color coat. And the most ideal option here is to paint the color coat after 3 to 4 hours of priming. Now, if you wait for the priming layer to completely dry, you're going to have to sand every surface again. However, if you paint the color coat within 3 to 4 hours, the primer is dry enough to not cause issues, yet fresh enough that the layers fuse together and bond, giving a proper bond between the layers. Now, the time between coats will vary based on brand to brand, so make sure you always read your manufacturer's instructions and follow those instructions. Now, in my case, I cannot paint immediately after because of the mistake where we over applied the paint and it started to drip. Instead, to correct our issue, we have to wait for the primer to completely dry and sand that flat again. So about 20 to 30 hours later, the primer is completely dry and we're ready to sand the doors. Now, unlike the first passes, we don't have to sand this a whole lot. Just 1 to 2 light passes on everything is more than enough. Additionally, where I missed this entire edge, we can go ahead and use that spray can to fill that in as well. Then after letting all this dry, we're ready to apply our color coat. So again, before our color coat, we want to wipe down everything with a lightly damp towel to ensure any dust is removed. Also, make sure to thoroughly mix your paint just like with the primer, and then set up the sprayer. Again, with some masking paper on the wall, we could practice our pattern and make sure we're familiar with our sprayer. And with all that complete, we can get to spraying our color coat. Again, just like before, we want to apply light, even coats. Now keep in mind that these panels will get at least 2 layers of paint, so don't worry if it isn't absolutely perfect or completely covered. It's better to hold back than over apply the paint, causing greater issues. Now if you're hanging the doors, again, you could spray both sides, but in my case, I have to spray one side at a time and then let them dry. In the meantime, we can move to painting the boxes. After painting, I waited 2 hours and went ahead and gave everything a 3rd coat of color to ensure proper coverage. Okay, finally, after so much work and we're in the home stretch, the only things that are left are to remove the masking from the cabinets, install the hardware on the doors, and screw the doors into their original location. And the final step is to come back and level your doors. If you're reusing the same hardware, chances are your doors are going to come out pretty level, but if you're changing your hardware like me, you're going to have to adjust all the doors to make them level. In my case, I also installed my new countertop, and the kitchen is finally complete. A final important thing to mention is that we left all of our doors and cabinets open for about 3 weeks. The Sherwin-Williams urethane enamel paint we used claims that it takes around 20 days to fully cure and reach its maximum hardness. So to avoid the cabinets from having sticking issues or any other issues, we're careful the first couple of weeks to make sure it reached its full hardness before damaging the cabinets. Now, after these 3 weeks of taking care of the cabinets, we continued to use them as normal. Now, this took a lot of time and effort, and I made some mistakes and there were bumps along the way, which I hope is a learning opportunity. This is something you could take pride in having done yourself and knowing it was done correctly. At the time of recording this, it's been over 6 months since I painted the cabinets, and they're still absolutely perfect like the day I finished. They've really held up well thus far, and I know they're gonna hold up for many years because I know I did everything correctly.